In the spring of 1987, a 32-year-old farmer named Everett Stanhope stood at a farm equipment liquidation sale outside Albion, Nebraska, and raised his hand to bid $40 on a cardboard box full of old paper. The auctioneer almost didn't list it. He held it up with one hand, tilted it toward the crowd so they could see what was inside scale tickets, rubber-banded by year-grain receipts folded in thirds, handwritten ledger pages soft at the edges from years of handling, and said more or less that if anybody wanted the lot, $40 would take the whole thing, and if nobody did, he'd set it on the tailgate and move on to the next item, which was a set of disc harrow blades in considerably better condition. Everett raised his hand. The man standing next to him, a corn and soybean farmer from over near Cedar Rapids, who had come for the planter and stayed for the rest, looked at him the way you look at someone who has just done something you cannot explain and have no particular interest in trying. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The expression carried everything the mild, dismissive bewilderment of a practical man watching another man do something impractical, and the faint relief of someone who is glad, at least, that it isn't him. The box weighed maybe 4 pounds. It smelled like a grain bin in August, that particular dry, dusty sweetness of stored corn mixed with old paper and the faint mineral smell of ink that has been sitting in the dark for a long time. The papers inside went back 16 years. People in Boone County talked about it for weeks afterward. A grown man, a serious farmer, paying good money for a dead man's paperwork. The story spread the way all stories spread in a county where the distance between the liquidation sale and the feed store and the elevator office and the coffee counter at the diner on the main square is less than a mile in any direction, and the same 12 people seem to occupy all of those spaces in rotation. By Tuesday, it was at the co-op. By Thursday, it had reached the diner. By Sunday, it had passed through the church parking lot and picked up weight at every stop, the way a story does when a community doesn't quite know what to make of something and fills the uncertainty with its own interpretation. His own brother Roy heard about it at the co-op on a Tuesday and called him that evening to ask what he thought he was doing. But what nobody in that county understood, not yet, not for another year, was that Everett Stanhope had not bought a box of junk. He had bought the only record that could prove what an entire community had quietly agreed to stop questioning. Before we go any further, if you're someone who believes that careful attention to the truth is worth something that the records nobody wants sometimes turn out to be the records that matter most, I'd ask you to hit subscribe and the bell notification so you don't miss the next story. There are more of them, and they are all about the same thing. Let me tell you about Everett Stanhope, because what he did with that box of paper only makes sense if you understand who he was and where he came from and what he had been taught from the time he was old enough to sit at a kitchen table and hold a pencil to believe about numbers. Everett was born in 1955 on a 320-acre farm in Boone County, Nebraska, the second of 3 children, and the only one who followed his father into the fields with any real and sustained attention. His older brother Roy had left for implement sales in Columbus by the time Everett was 17, pulled by the salary and the regular hours and the particular freedom of a job that ended when you locked the door. His younger sister had married young and moved to Omaha, and her relationship with the farm became the relationship of someone who had grown up somewhere and moved away, fond occasional, marked by the kind of selective memory that smooths out the difficult parts. The farm, by the time Everett was in his early 20s, was already becoming his in every practical way, though the deed still carried his father's name. He was the one who walked the fields in the evenings after supper to check the crop. He was the one who called the parts dealer when the planter went down. He was the one who sat across from the elevator manager twice a year and reviewed the settlement sheets with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who had been taught to read those documents as carefully as he read anything. His father was August Stanhope. August had come back from Korea in 1953 with a preference for silence and a deep, durable suspicion of anything he could not verify himself. He had served as a supply clerk for nearly 2 years, which meant he had spent the better part of his military service tracking the distance between what the requisition form said and what actually arrived on the truck. He had watched officers sign delivery confirmations for supplies that had not come. He had seen the gap between the paper record and the physical reality, the actual crates, the actual pallets, the actual count of what was in the warehouse, be a gap that someone had chosen to create and someone else had chosen not to examine. He came home to Boone County and applied that understanding to farming with the same methodical attention he had applied to everything else in his life. He kept a ledger, not a casual ledger, not a notebook with occasional entries or figures penciled in when he happened to think of it. A disciplined double-entry ledger that he updated every Friday evening without exception, sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp with a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow and a mechanical pencil that he kept sharpened to a consistent point because he believed, without ever saying so directly, that the condition of your tools reflected the condition of your thinking. He recorded every bushel sold, every input purchased, every fuel fill, every repair bill, every hour of hired labor, and what it cost. He recorded the date and the weather on planting day and the date and the weather on harvest day. He recorded his field-by-field yield estimates calculated by hand on graph paper from planted population and observed stand counts checked against the previous 3 years of performance on that specific ground. He kept the scale tickets in a manila envelope clipped to the inside front cover of each year's ledger. He kept the elevator receipts in a second manila envelope clipped to the back. Every spring when the books were closed on the previous crop year, he laid both envelopes open on the table and reconciled them scale tickets against elevator receipts, both against his own field estimates. The arithmetic checked twice before he wrote the final figures in ink. And in a column at the far right of the reconciliation page, in his precise, unhurried block printing, he noted the gap between what his record said he had harvested and what the elevator said it had received. He had labeled that column with a single word: difference. August taught Everett to keep the ledger when the boy was 12 years old. It was October of 1967, a Friday evening, the fields already harvested and the year winding down toward the long quiet of a Nebraska winter. August sat him down at the kitchen table and went through the system from the first principle, not from the beginning of the current year's ledger, but from the beginning of the method itself. Why you kept 2 envelopes, why you reconciled them separately before combining them, why you made the field estimate before you saw the scale ticket, not after, so that the estimate was genuinely independent and not unconsciously shaped by the number you already knew. Why you never let a discrepancy sit in the column without an explanation attached to it, even if the explanation was only unknown. Investigate further. He told Everett that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion, and that opinions were fine for conversation, but had no place in a farm record. Everett asked what happened when the numbers didn't match. August set down the mechanical pencil and looked at his son for a moment. Not a long moment, but a considered one, the look of a man deciding whether the question deserves the serious answer or the simple one. His voice came quiet and level, the voice he used when he meant something completely. Then you find out why. That was the lesson. Not what to record, not how to format the columns. The lesson was what to do when the numbers disagreed. You did not average them, you did not round them, you did not accept the more convenient one and discard the other. You found out why. Everett took over the ledger completely by the time he was 15. August checked his work for the first 2 years, sitting across the table on Friday evenings, going through the entries column by column with the same mechanical pencil, and then stopped checking because there was nothing to correct. The boy had understood not just the mechanics but the spirit of the system, the refusal to let an unexplained gap become a settled matter, the habit of treating a discrepancy as an open question rather than a rounding error, the understanding that a number source was always findable if you were willing to go looking for it. The workshop behind the farmhouse was a poured concrete building 30 feet by 40, with a wood stove in the corner that August fed with hedgewood he cut himself every fall. The workbench along the south wall he had built from oak planks in 1952, the year before he shipped out, heavy level its surface, worn smooth in the places where he worked most often. He had a lathe he'd bought, used from a machine shop in Kearney in 1962, a drill press on a steel stand, bolted to the floor, a welding rig with a cart he'd welded himself, and enough hand tools arranged on 3 pegboards to handle most of what a farm required. He maintained everything himself, not because he couldn't afford a serviceman, but because maintaining the tools was part of understanding them. He calibrated his grain moisture meter every fall against a reference sample he kept in a sealed glass jar on the shelf above the workbench, a sample he had prepared himself from certified moisture grain and had verified against the state extension office's reference standard. He checked his platform scale with certified test weights every spring before the first load left the field. He did not trust the manufacturer's stated calibration interval. He used his own. He was not a suspicious man. He did not distrust people as a general condition. He extended ordinary good faith to his neighbors and his suppliers, and his elevator manager the same as anyone. He verified. There is a difference between suspicion and verification, and August Stanhope had understood it since the age of 20, standing in an army warehouse in Korea, watching an officer sign a form confirming the presence of supplies that were not there. He died in February of 1983 during Everett's 28th year of a heart attack in the machine shed on a cold morning when the temperature had dropped overnight and the tractor needed attention before the day's work could begin. He was 61 years old. He had been farming Boone County ground for 30 years and had never once closed a crop year with an unexplained entry in the difference column. He left Everett the farm, 320 acres, with no mortgage and no operating loan cleared and paid for, over 3 decades of careful work. A savings account holding $34,000 built the same way. The workshop and everything in it inventoried and maintained every tool in its place on the pegboard, and the ledger, going back to 1958, 25 years of Friday evenings at the kitchen table, the mechanical pencil, the 2 manila envelopes, the difference column running honest and close in every year that the elevator equipment had been functioning correctly. He left the ledger to Everett specifically by name in a handwritten note attached to the will. Roy received a newer tractor and a cash payment that acknowledged his years away from the farm without overstating the contribution. Everett received a record of everything. The note was 3 sentences. August had not been a man who required many words when a few precise ones would do. The manila envelopes from the last completed crop year were still clipped to the inside covers of the binder when Everett found it on the desk in the small room off the kitchen where August had always kept the farm records. He stood in that room for a long time before he picked it up. Everett had been farming alongside his father for 6 years by then, and he continued farming alone after August's death without asking Roy for help or the bank for money. He grew corn on 240 acres, soybeans on 40, and kept the remaining 40 in hay for the beef cattle he ran on the back pasture, a dozen head more for the discipline of a diversified operation than for the margin, which was thin. He bought inputs with cash at the start of each season and sold grain with cash at the end. He did not have a line of credit. He did not want one. He had watched the early years of that decade unfold around him, the way you watch something you have been warned about, the interest rates climbing past 18%, the land values that had been bid up through the optimism of the late 70s, collapsing all at once as the optimism ran out, the farms that had borrowed heavily against inflated ground going to auction in a procession that was steady and grim and showed no sign of stopping. He knew the names of the families. He had grown up with some of their children. He watched it with a stillness that people sometimes mistook for indifference. It was not indifference. It was the particular loneliness of having understood something too early, of having watched the storm form on the horizon and known what it would do and been unable to do anything about it but keep your own roof sound and wait. He did not feel superior to the men who had borrowed. He knew the pressure they had been under, the way the land values had made the loans seem reasonable, the way the optimism of the time had felt like evidence. He had felt it too. He had simply had August's voice in his ear telling him that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion and that borrowed money against inflated collateral was a number you could not verify against anything real. He sent food to 2 of the families when their farms went to auction. He did not say anything about the auctions. There was nothing to say that would help. By the spring of 1987, Everett had $71,000 in savings, a paid-for farm, and a growing conviction that something was wrong with the numbers coming out of the Boone County elevator. Not wrong in a way he could demonstrate yet. Not wrong in a way that constituted an accusation or even a clear complaint. Just wrong in the quiet, persistent, systematic way that August had taught him to notice, the way a sound at the edge of your hearing keeps returning at the same interval and you find yourself listening for it even when you're not trying to, and eventually you accept that the sound is real, and that it is coming from somewhere specific, and that somewhere specific can be found. His own difference column had been running between 4 and 6% for 3 consecutive years. 4 to 6% below what his field estimates said he should have harvested, below what his yield monitor reported at the end of each pass, below what the arithmetic of planted acres and average stand and historical yield on that specific ground should have produced. He had checked his yield monitor calibration himself against the manufacturer's procedure twice. He had weighed his grain cart on his own platform scale and confirmed the tare. He had reviewed every moisture dockage calculation on every settlement sheet against the elevator's posted moisture schedule line by line and found no arithmetic error. He had asked the elevator manager about it twice in separate conversations, a year apart. The manager, a man named Denny Haas, who had taken the position 2 years earlier and who was polite and thorough and entirely convinced of his own equipment's accuracy, had explained shrinkage and moisture loss and handling tolerance and the allowable variance built into the state scale certification. He had offered to walk Everett through the weighing process on his next delivery. Everett had accepted and had watched carefully and had not found anything he could point to specifically. The gap remained. Denny Haas did not change the numbers. Then Lester Covell died. Lester had farmed 480 acres of Boone County ground for 32 years. He had started with a rented 160 and built the operation carefully buying ground when prices were reasonable and his cash position was sound, farming it the way farmers of his generation farmed it, without a great deal of equipment sophistication, but with a great deal of attention, walking his fields in the evenings after supper, the same way August had, reading the crop, the way you read something you have spent your whole life studying. He had been 74 years old when he died in January of 1987, and the farm had been sold by his estate to settle a modest debt and divide what remained among his children, 3 of them scattered across the state. The liquidation sale was in March, a cold gray morning, with the last of the winter hanging in the air, and the fields still frozen and bare in every direction. The crowd was reasonable for a sale of that size, 60, maybe 70 people, mostly farmers from the county, and a few equipment dealers from the surrounding towns. The planter went for more than expected. The combine went for less. The shop tools drew a small crowd of their own, the way good shop tools always do among people who understand what they're looking at. The cardboard box came near the end. The auctioneer held it up with one hand, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who has sold 10,000 lots and learned not to editorialize scale tickets, grain receipts, handwritten records going back 16 years. He said $40 would take the whole thing, and if nobody bid, he'd leave it on the tailgate, and they'd move to the last item. Everett raised his hand. The drive home took 20 minutes. He set the box on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a moment before he took off his jacket. Then he sat down and began to sort. Roy called that Tuesday evening, his voice carrying the particular edge it always carried when he felt his younger brother had done something that reflected on the family without adequately consulting the family's opinion. "I heard you spent $40 on a box of old scale tickets from the Covell sale. You want to explain that to me?" Everett said he'd bought some records he wanted to look at. Roy said that Lester Covell had been confused in his last years, that the old man had been going on about the elevator shorting farmers for the better part of a decade, and that nobody had taken it seriously because there was nothing to take seriously. He said the man had been 74 years old and tired and looking for something to blame. Everett said he appreciated the call. He hung up and went back to the kitchen table, where the papers were already sorted into their groupings, scale tickets by crop year, elevator receipts by crop year, the graph paper yield maps in a separate stack, and the notebook set aside deliberately for last because you gathered the raw data before you read someone else's conclusions about it. He worked through the scale tickets first. Lester had kept everyone, 16 years of them rubber-banded by crop year and labeled in the same deliberate, unhurried hand that Everett would come to recognize across every document in the box. He matched them against the elevator receipts year by year, building the picture himself. Then he brought his own field estimates into the comparison, Lester's estimates calculated field by field on graph paper, using a method that Everett recognized immediately and completely, because it was the same method August had taught him, built on the same principles, arriving at the same kind of number through the same kind of careful, independent observation. It took him most of the evening. When he was done, he sat back in the chair and looked at what 16 years of another man's careful work had produced on his kitchen table. The gap was there. It had been there since 1975. It ran between 4 and 8% every year, sometimes higher in wet years, when the moisture dockage was heavier and the arithmetic more complex, sometimes lower in dry years, when the grain came in clean and the calculations were simpler but never zero, never in the farmer's favor, always running in the same direction, always against Lester Covell, and for the elevator's final tally. Then Everett opened the notebook. Lester had started it in 1976, 1 year after the gap had first appeared, consistently enough in his records to constitute a pattern rather than a single bad year. He had noticed it the way August had trained Everett to notice things not by going looking for a problem, but by doing the reconciliation honestly and letting the numbers say what they wanted to say. The notebook was his attempt over the following 11 years to explain what the numbers were saying. He had tried moisture. He had recalculated every dockage figure on every scale ticket against the elevator's posted schedule year by year, and the arithmetic was correct. He had tried his yield monitor. He had pulled the monitor from the combine in the fall of 1977 and sent it to the dealer in Norfolk for recalibration, paid for a factory-certified instrument, and run it for a full season before comparing his records again. The gap had not closed. He had tried the weight of his grain cart, borrowing a certified platform scale from a neighbor and running loaded cart weights before leaving the field on 3 separate days across 2 different fields. The numbers had matched his delivery weights closely enough that the difference was accounted for by the time it took to drive the road into town. He had eliminated each explanation one by one, writing the elimination in the notebook with the patient, methodical care of a man who had been farming for 30 years and understood that a problem you couldn't solve was still worth documenting. By 1984, the handwriting in the notebook had changed slightly, the letters a little larger, the pen pressure lighter, the hand of a man in his early 70s, for whom the physical act of writing had become a small effort rather than an automatic one. But the thinking had not changed. He had written in an entry dated October of that year, in a passage that Everett read 3 times without moving. I have checked everything within my power to check. The discrepancy is not in my equipment, and it is not in my calculations. I cannot find its source in my own operation. I have begun to believe the source lies somewhere between my field and the elevator's final figure, in the weighing itself or in some step of the process around the weighing that I am not in a position to observe. I don't know how to reach that part of the problem from where I stand. I'm not certain I have enough time left to find someone who can. He had been 71 when he wrote it. He had kept the notebook for 3 more years after that, updating it each fall, and the gap had continued, and the source had remained where he had placed it, somewhere between his field and the elevator's tally, in a part of the process he had not been able to reach. Everett set the notebook down on the table. He sat in the quiet of the farmhouse, the refrigerator's low hum, the creak of the house settling in the March cold, the wind coming across the flat ground from the northwest, with nothing between it and the kitchen window for a considerable distance. Then he stood up, went to the hallway shelf, and pulled the manila envelopes for 1984, 1985, and 1986. He set them on the table next to Lester's scale tickets. His own gap was smaller, his operation was smaller, his delivery volume lower, the percentage running at the lower end of the range he'd been tracking. But it was there. It was consistent. It ran in the same direction every year without exception, and it had been running that way since before August died. The manila envelope from 1982, the last full year August had been alive to reconcile, still had the small pencil check mark in the upper right corner that August had made when he confirmed the year's figures were complete. Just a check. August's way of closing a year's account. Everett looked at that check mark for a long time. He thought about what it meant that 2 farmers on 2 separate operations, keeping their records independently and without knowledge of each other's methods, had arrived at the same unexplained gap, running in the same direction for over a decade. He thought about Lester Covell writing in a notebook at the age of 71 that he had begun to believe the source was somewhere between his field and the elevator's tally, and that he was not certain he had enough time left to find someone who could reach it. He thought about the county's verdict on Lester Covell, the polite dismissive consensus that the old man had been tired and confused and looking for something to blame in his last years. He thought about how that verdict had preceded any examination of the records. He thought about how the records had gone to auction in a cardboard box for $40 because the verdict had made the records seem not worth examining. That was why nobody at the liquidation sale had understood the purchase. They had seen a young farmer paying $40 for a dead man's junk. They had been watching something else, entirely the beginning of an investigation that would take 3 years and the elevator's certification and return $340,000 to the farmers of Boone County. The farmers who had delivered grain in good faith and had been shorted quietly and consistently for over a decade. Lester Covell had known it. He had written it down. He had not been confused. He had not been tired and looking for blame. He had been a careful man doing careful work, and the careful work had been right, and the community had decided without looking that it wasn't worth looking at. Everett pulled a fresh sheet of graph paper from the drawer beneath the table. He uncapped a pen. He wrote the date at the top of the page in the same block printing August had used, because that was how he had been taught to open a new document, and it had never occurred to him to do it differently. He began to build his own version of Lester's comparison 2 columns side by side, Lester's gap figures and his own year by year from 1975 forward, the pattern made visible across 2 separate operations and 16 years of unwitnessed, careful, entirely correct observation by a man the county had already decided to forget. The lamp above the table was the same lamp August had worked under every Friday evening for 25 years. The table was the same table. The manila envelopes worn soft at the corners from years of opening and closing held the same tickets in the same order. Outside, the March wind moved across the fields with the patient indifference of weather that has been doing what it does for a long time and will continue doing it long after the particular concerns of the people beneath it have been resolved or abandoned. The fields kept their count. They always did. He worked through the rest of that night and into the early hours of the following morning, and when he finally set the pen down, the graph paper held 2 columns of figures that stretched across 16 years and 2 separate farm operations, and told a story that was quiet and patient and entirely without ambiguity. The pattern was there. He could see it clearly, but seeing a pattern and proving a pattern were 2 different things, and Everett Stanhope had been raised by a man who understood that difference down to the bone. He folded the graph paper in thirds and slid it into the back of Lester's notebook. He put the notebook in the filing box, alongside his own records. He went to bed at 2 in the morning and was up at 5:30 to feed the cattle, because the cattle did not adjust their schedule to accommodate a man's late nights, and the work of the farm continued regardless of what a man had stayed up discovering. That was March. He spent April thinking. He thought the way August had taught him to think about a problem that resisted easy explanation, not by rushing toward a conclusion, not by constructing a theory and then looking for evidence to support it, but by walking around the problem slowly from different angles in different light, asking himself at each position what he might be missing and what explanation he had not yet considered and ruled out. He was 32 years old. He had been farming alone for 4 years. He understood his own competence well enough to know where it ended, and what he had found in Lester Covell's records had brought him to that boundary. He knew farming. He knew how to read a scale ticket and calculate a moisture dockage and estimate a field's yield from a stand count and historical performance. He knew how to keep a ledger and reconcile 2 sets of figures against each other and note the difference in a column labeled difference. These things he knew with the completeness of a man who had been doing them since he was 12 years old under the instruction of someone who did not accept approximation. What he did not know, what he had never needed to know before this spring, was the specific technical vocabulary of certified grain scale calibration. He did not know how a load cell worked, or what a linearity error was, or how an electronic calibration system could produce a current certificate while concealing a systematic measurement error in the middle of its operating range. He did not know what questions to ask or who to ask them of. He needed someone who did. The name came through the county extension office, not because he asked for it directly, he was careful about what he said, and to whom at this stage, because he understood that a question asked in the wrong way in a small county could become a rumor before it became an answer. He sat across from the extension agent, Dennis Albrecht, on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, and described the problem in the most neutral terms he could manage the terms of a farmer with a technical question rather than a farmer with a grievance. He said he was trying to understand how certified grain scales were calibrated in Nebraska. He said he was curious about the process, specifically about the difference between electronic calibration and physical calibration with test weights. Dennis listened with the patient attention of a man who had been in extension for 11 years and had developed the ability to hear the question behind the question. He looked at Everett for a moment when the explanation was finished. Then he wrote a name on the back of a business card and pushed it across the desk. Edmund Cray, retired Weights and Measures Inspector, formerly with the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. 23 years in the division before he retired, living now in Fullerton, 20 minutes south of Albion on Highway 14. Everett thanked him and drove home and called the number on the card that same evening. Edmund Cray answered on the third ring. His voice was unhurried and flat, in the particular way of men who have spent careers being the calmest person in complicated situations, not cold, not unfriendly, simply undecorated. He listened without interrupting while Everett explained what he was looking for. Someone who understood grain scale certification at a technical level, someone who could accompany him to the elevator on a few delivery loads and observe the weighing process from a position of expertise. A pause on the line, measured, considering. Edmund's voice came back even and direct. "What are you paying?" Everett said $200 for a day's work, with the understanding that a day's work might mean riding along on 3 separate loads across 3 separate days. Another pause, then, "I'll need to bring my own reference equipment." Everett said that was fine. Edmund said he could come the first week of October, when the corn harvest was typically underway in Boone County, and the elevator would be running at normal volume. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October in a truck that was older than it needed to be and maintained better than most, a man in his late 60s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with a clipboard under one arm and a canvas equipment bag in the other hand, and the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by what he found in the world sometime in the middle of his career. He shook Everett's hand at the end of the driveway, with the brief solid handshake of a man who considered the gesture a formality rather than a statement, looked at the fields for approximately 3 seconds and said nothing about them. He was not there for the fields. They rode to the elevator together on 3 loads across 3 separate days, each load a different time of day and a different commodity. Corn on the first 2 days, soybeans on the third. Everett drove. Edmund sat in the passenger seat with the clipboard on his knee and the canvas bag at his feet, and said almost nothing on the way there and almost nothing on the way back. At the elevator he watched. He watched the way a man watches who is not looking for anything specific, but has trained himself over 23 years of professional attention to notice everything that is available to be noticed. He watched the approach to the inbound scale. He watched the way the truck's wheels settled onto the platform. He watched the display register. He watched the operator's hands and eyes and the sequence of steps between the truck stopping on the scale and the weight being recorded on the ticket. He watched the moisture meter probe go into the grain and the reading come up on the display and the dockage figure be entered into the calculation. He watched the truck pull off the scale and the tare weight be recorded and the net figure be calculated from the 2 numbers. He watched all of it with the same unchanging expression, and he wrote notes in a small, precise hand in his notebook, and he said nothing to the elevator staff that was not a normal courtesy, and nothing in his manner suggested to anyone watching that he was doing anything other than riding along with a farmer on a routine delivery. On the first load, Edmund found nothing he could point to specifically. The scale read within its certified tolerance on the light end of the platform load. The moisture meter performed within its stated range. The dockage arithmetic was correct. The net bushel figure on the ticket matched the calculation. He made his notes and said nothing. On the drive back, Everett asked him what he thought. Edmund looked at the road ahead and said, "I think we need to go back." On the second load, Edmund asked Denny Haas if he could review the scale's current calibration certificate. Denny produced it without hesitation, a current certificate from a Lincoln-based calibration service issued the previous spring bearing the appropriate state authorization number. Edmund looked at it for a time that was slightly longer than it would take to simply read it. He looked at the date of issue, he looked at the name of the certifying technician, he looked at the method notation in the lower left corner of the document. Then he asked a question in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything when had the scale last been calibrated under actual physical load, meaning with certified test weights placed on the platform surface, not with the calibration performed through the electronic adjustment interface of the scale's control system. Denny Haas said the electronic calibration was the certified and accepted method under current Nebraska Department of Agriculture guidelines, which was accurate. Edmund agreed that it was a certified method. He said so without equivocation because it was true, and he was not in the habit of saying things that were not true. He handed the certificate back. He wrote something in his notebook, 2 lines Everett could see, though not what they said. He thanked Denny for his time. On the drive back, Everett did not ask anything. He had begun to understand Edmund Cray well enough to know that questions before Edmund was ready to answer them produced shorter and less useful responses than patience did. They were 2 miles from the farm when Edmund spoke. His voice came measured, facing forward through the windshield as though he were explaining something to the road. An electronic calibration adjusts the scale's 0 point and its upper range end point. It assumes the scale's response is linear between those 2 points that, if it reads correctly at 0 and correctly at the maximum, it reads correctly at every load in between. A load cell that has developed a nonlinearity problem, a change in the relationship between force and signal in the middle of its range, will pass an electronic calibration and still misread loads that fall in the affected range. The affected range for a grain elevator scale is almost exactly where every normal delivery load falls. Everett drove for a moment without speaking. Then he asked how long that kind of error could go undetected. Edmund said, "Until someone puts a certified test weight on the platform and reads the display." The third load was a Wednesday morning, the light hardened level across the harvested cornfields, the sky the specific blue of a Nebraska October that has no intention of turning. Edmund brought a 50-pound certified test weight from the bed of his truck, carrying it in both hands with the careful, unhurried competence of a man who has handled precision equipment for a long time and knows that careful handling is part of maintaining it. He set it on the elevator's inbound scale platform himself, placing it in the center of the surface, the way the calibration procedure specified. He stepped back. The scale display settled. It read 49 pounds and 2 ounces. 14 ounces light on a 50-pound reference weight. Edmund looked at the display for a moment without changing expression. He wrote the reading in his notebook. He wrote the date and the time and the weather conditions and the scale serial number from the plate on the side of the housing. He picked up the test weight and carried it back to the truck. He said nothing to the elevator staff. He thanked Denny Haas for the access and shook his hand, and they drove back toward the farm in the October morning with the fields empty and bare on both sides of the road. Everett did the arithmetic before they reached the end of the elevator's driveway. 14 ounces, light per 50 pounds. That was a proportional error of 1.75%. On a 10,000-pound load of corn, a standard load for a farm of his size, that was 175 pounds short of the actual weight delivered. At $1.80 per bushel and 56 pounds to the bushel, 175 pounds was $5.63 per load. He delivered approximately 200 loads to that elevator in a good corn year. 200 loads at $5.63 was $1,126 per year. Over the 3 years, he had been carefully tracking the gap in his own records that was $3,378. He thought about Lester Covell, larger operation, higher delivery volume, 16 years. He thought about every farmer in Boone County who had been delivering grain to that elevator since whenever this error had been introduced into the scale's response. He drove without speaking. The fields moved past in the window, the dark turned soil patient and indifferent in the October light. When he pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine, Edmund Cray sat for a moment before opening the door. He looked at nothing in particular through the windshield, the notebook on his knee, the canvas bag at his feet. His voice came quiet, deliberate, the voice of a man stating a fact rather than rendering an opinion. You have documented evidence of a systematic measurement error consistent with what I observed on the platform today. The pattern across your records and the Covell records is consistent with the magnitude of the error. You have grounds for a formal written complaint to the Nebraska Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures Division. A written complaint with adequate supporting documentation triggers a mandatory compliance inspection. Everett asked if Edmund would put his findings and observations in a written report. Edmund said he would. He said he charged his standard daily rate for report preparation, which was the same $200. He said Everett would have it within 2 weeks. He shook Everett's hand at the end of the driveway, the same brief, solid handshake as the first morning, and drove south toward Fullerton on Highway 14, and the dust from his truck settled back onto the gravel road, and the October fields on both sides went on being exactly what they were. Everett stood in the driveway until the truck was out of sight. Then he went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He uncapped a pen. He began to write. The complaint file took him the better part of 4 months. He worked on it in the evenings after the farm work was finished for the day, sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp with a cup of coffee, going cold at his elbow, in the same spot August's coffee had gone cold in the same spot for 25 years. He worked methodically the way he had been taught to work. Not quickly, not with the urgency of someone trying to make a case, but with the patience of someone trying to make a record. There was a difference. The record had to be accurate first and persuasive second, because accuracy was the only thing that would survive scrutiny, and scrutiny was what a formal complaint invited. He used Lester Covell's 16 years of scale tickets and his own 7 years of records. He calculated the gap for each crop year field by field, where Lester's data supported that level of granularity, cross-referencing scale tickets against elevator receipts, against field yield estimates in a three-way reconciliation that produced for each year a documented discrepancy with its source materials clearly identified. He was not an accountant. He made arithmetic errors and caught them and corrected them. He made different errors. He caught those too. He built the document the way August had taught him to build any record, slowly, with attention checking each figure against its source before he moved on. He typed the final version on the typewriter he had bought second-hand from the office supply in Albion in 1981, a machine he had used for correspondence and document headers and the occasional letter to the extension office, but never for anything of this length or consequence. The keys stuck occasionally, particularly the letter E, which required a slightly firmer touch than the others. The ribbon was getting thin by the time he reached the appendices. He ordered a replacement from the office supply and kept going. The completed document was 42 pages with 4 appendices. Edmund Cray's written report was attached as Exhibit A, 2 pages single-spaced, written in the same flat, unhurried prose as Edmund's speech with the scale serial number, and the test weight reading, and the date and weather conditions, and a technical explanation of load cell linearity error that was precise enough to be useful and plain enough to be understood by someone without a background in measurement science. The 16 years of Lester Covell's records, organized by crop year and cross-referenced to the complaint's central calculations, were Exhibit B. Everett's own 7 years of records were Exhibit C. The graph paper comparison sheet he had built on the night of the liquidation sale, the 2 columns side by side, Lester's gap and his own running the same direction for 16 years, was Exhibit D. He mailed it to the Nebraska Department of Agriculture in Lincoln on a Thursday morning in the second week of February 1988. Certified mail return receipt requested. He drove to the post office himself and watched the clerk weigh the envelope and stamp it with the date, and he kept the receipt in his jacket pocket until he got home and could file it properly. He planted his corn in May, the same way he had planted it every May since 1983. The return receipt came back signed in the third week of February. He slid it into a manila envelope labeled in block printing complaint, NDA 1988, and clipped it to the inside front cover of that year's ledger. The Nebraska Department of Agriculture sent an inspector to the Boone County elevator in the second week of April 1988. The inspector's name was Carl Wendt, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning without advance notice, which was the standard protocol for a compliance inspection triggered by a formal written complaint. He had 2 assistants with him and a set of certified test weights ranging from 10 pounds to 100, and he spent 4 hours at the elevator testing the inbound scale at multiple points across its operating range and reviewing the calibration records going back to the installation of the current control system. He found the error. The inbound scale had been operating with a calibration error of between 0.8 and 1.4% across its mid-range loading capacity for an indeterminate period. The error was consistent with the pattern documented in Everett's complaint and consistent with the measurement Edmund Cray had recorded on the platform in October. The magnitude of the error fell within the range that load cell linearity degradation could produce without being detected by routine electronic calibration checks. Then Calvent pulled the electronic calibration log from the scale's control system. The log went back to the installation of the current software version. It showed routine electronic zero and span adjustments performed on schedule every 6 months, each one producing a certificate of current compliance. It showed no physical test weight verifications. It showed no anomalies flagged by the system. It showed no indication that anyone had placed a certified weight on the platform surface at any point since the software had been installed. It also showed the date the current software version had been loaded onto the scale's control system. The date was the spring of 1974, 14 years. Lester Covell had noticed the gap in his records in 1975. He had kept a notebook for 11 years. He had been 74 years old when he died, and he had written in that notebook 3 years before his death that he believed the source was somewhere between his field and the elevator's final tally, and that he was not certain he had enough time left to find someone who could reach that part of the problem. A software installation log had confirmed his conclusion in an afternoon. He had been right from the first entry, right about the gap, right about its direction, right about its source. He had eliminated every explanation within his power to test and had correctly identified the one he could not reach. He had spent 11 years being careful and correct, and had not lived to see a single figure in his notebook vindicated. That was the kind of thing that happened when a community decided that a farmer's careful observations were the symptoms of confusion rather than the products of rigor. The elevator's certification was suspended that week pending correction of the scale and verification of the repair by a state-authorized calibration service. The co-op board convened an emergency session the following Monday. They retained an accounting firm from Lincoln to calculate the total underpayment to all farmers who had delivered grain to the elevator between the spring of 1974 and the date of the inspection. The accounting firm worked for 4 months. The total came to $1.2 million across all affected farm operations. The co-op's insurance carrier reviewed the claim and the documentation and negotiated the settlement over the following 2 months. The farmers of Boone County received $340,000 in aggregate restitution, the amount the carrier agreed to cover after reviewing the co-op's policy limits and the extent of the documented liability. It was distributed on a prorated basis according to verified delivery records. Farmers who had maintained complete records of their deliveries received their full calculated share. Farmers who had discarded their scale tickets received what could be calculated from the elevator's own records, which were less complete than the farmers' records in certain years. Everett Stanhope received $18,400. The estate of Lester Covell, administered by his daughter Patricia Covell Marsh in Lincoln, received $31,200, calculated from 16 years of records that Lester had kept at a desk in a farmhouse that had already been sold by a man who had died at 74, still trying to prove what a compliance inspector had confirmed in a Tuesday morning visit. Patricia had driven up from Lincoln to meet Everett once in the spring of 1988, before the inspection results were known, but after Everett had filed the complaint and had reason to believe the outcome. He had called her through the estate attorney, whose name appeared on the sale documents for the Covell farm. She had driven up on a Saturday morning in March and sat across the kitchen table from him for nearly 2 hours while he walked her through her father's records alongside his own, the scale tickets, the notebook, the graph paper, comparison, the pattern that ran clear and consistent across 16 years of a careful man's careful attention. She was a woman in her mid-40s, composed and direct, with her father's deliberate way of listening, fully present, not interrupting, waiting until a thought was complete before responding. She had gone through the records page by page, handling the old paper with a care that suggested she understood what it represented, even before she understood what it proved. When they were finished, she sat for a moment with her hands resting on the last manila envelope. Her voice came low and steady, directed at the envelope rather than at Everett. He talked about this for years, the last few years especially. We told him he was tired. We told him the farm was wearing him out, and he was looking for a reason that wasn't in himself. Everett said he thought her father had been doing what a careful farmer does when the numbers don't add up. She looked up at him then directly, with the expression of someone absorbing something they had needed to hear for a long time. She nodded slowly once. She drove back to Lincoln that afternoon. She sent a letter in November after the restitution checks were distributed on plain white stationery in a hand that resembled her father's in its deliberateness. It was 4 sentences. She said her father would have been glad the records had been found useful. She said she was grateful they had gone to someone who knew what they were. She said she hoped Everett understood what he had done. She said she thought her father had. Everett kept the letter in the manila envelope labeled Complaint ND A 1988 behind the return receipt. He did not hold a press conference. He did not write a letter to the newspaper. He did not accept the invitation from the Nebraska Farmers Union, which arrived in August of 1988 on official letterhead from their Lincoln office to speak at their annual meeting that November. He read the invitation twice and put it in a file folder in the desk drawer. He went back to work. Roy called when the newspaper story ran. The Albion news leader had put the elevator certification suspension on the front page of the local section in June, a brief piece that mentioned in the 3rd paragraph that the formal complaint had originated with a Boone County farmer who had acted on records purchased at a farm liquidation sale. It did not name Everett. Everyone in the county knew anyway. Roy's voice was different from the call in March of the previous year. The edge was gone, replaced by something that occupied the space between acknowledgement and apology, without quite being either the sound of a man who had been wrong about something and was trying to find a way to say, so that didn't require him to say so directly, "I saw the paper." Everett said yes. A silence on the line. The long particular silence of 2 brothers who had grown up in the same house and diverged somewhere in their 20s and had been navigating the distance ever since. Roy's voice came again quieter, with the effort of a man choosing words carefully. "I shouldn't have said what I said about Covell, about the records. I didn't know what I was talking about." Everett said it was all right. Roy said he didn't think it was, actually. He said he thought he owed Everett an apology, and that was what he was doing. Another silence, shorter this time. Everett said, "Come by sometime." Roy said he would. He didn't. Not that year, and not the following year either. But the call itself was different from every call before it, and Everett recognized the difference, the way he recognized differences in numbers, not with drama, but with the quiet attention of someone who notes what has changed and files it accurately and waits to see what the change means over time. The 1988 drought arrived that summer and took a third of the corn crop across the central part of the state. Everett lost yield the same as everyone. He did not lose the farm. His operating costs were low enough, and his savings, rebuilt after the restitution check to just over $84,000, were deep enough that a bad year was a bad year and not a catastrophe. He watched 3 farms in the county go to auction that fall, farms that had borrowed against land values that a drought year had done nothing to improve. He sent food to one of the families without saying anything about the auction. He updated the ledger on Friday evening. The difference column for 1988 ran at less than 1% within the tolerance range Edmund Cray had told him to expect after a properly corrected and recalibrated scale. He noted it in the column. He closed the year's manila envelopes. He clipped them into the binder. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, the lamp warm above the table. He thought about Edmund Cray driving south on Highway 14 with his canvas equipment bag in the passenger seat, heading back to Fullerton after the 3rd elevator load, having done what he had been asked to do, and having done it with the same flat, precise professionalism he brought to everything. He thought about Patricia Marsh, sitting across this table in March with her hands on her father's manila envelope. He thought about Lester Covell writing in a narrow-ruled notebook at the age of 71 that he had begun to believe the source was somewhere between his field and the elevator's final figure. The difference column ran at less than 1%. That was enough. That was in the end exactly what it was supposed to be. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed. And somewhere to the south, in a house in Fullerton that Everett had never visited, a retired weights and measures inspector set his clipboard on the kitchen counter and put the kettle on, and did not think about the Boone County elevator specifically, but thought, as he often did in the evenings, about the particular satisfaction of a number that had been wrong for a long time finally reading correctly. 50 pounds even, the way it was always supposed to read. In the spring of 1993, 160 acres came to auction in the northeast corner of Boone County, 2 miles from Everett's home farm. The ground had belonged to Clifford Wessel, who had farmed it for 20 years and had borrowed against it in 1979 at land values that the following decade had not sustained. Clifford had held on longer than most men in his position, refinancing twice, restructuring the terms, once cutting his operation down to what was essential and running it on the thinnest margin that would still service the debt. He had run out of room in the winter of 1992 and had signed the auction papers in January with the particular stillness of a man who has been fighting a thing for a long time and has finally accepted the outcome. The auction was set for the 3rd Thursday of March. Everett had been keeping a separate notebook since 1989, smaller than the ledger, plain brown cover, its pages filled in. A hand that was less formal than the ledger's, because this was observation rather than record watching, rather than keeping. He had attended every farm auction in Boone County and the 3 adjacent counties within reasonable driving distance, and in this notebook he had recorded the per-acre sale price of every parcel, the soil productivity rating from the county assessor's records, the name of the buyer when he could learn it, and the terms of the sale when they were disclosed. By the spring of 1993, The notebook held 34 transactions going back 4 years. He had not been ready to act on any of them. He had been watching the market the way August had watched the elevator, systematically, without a conclusion already formed, letting the numbers say what they wanted to say in their own time. The vessel ground changed things. It was 2 miles away. He had driven past it 10,000 times. He knew the soil the way you know the soil of ground you have watched in every season for 30 years, the way it drained after a heavy rain, the way it held moisture through a dry July, the particular dark color of it in October when the crop was off and the field was turned. The county assessor had it rated at 87 on the Corn Suitability Index. Good ground, honest ground, the kind of ground that yielded what you asked of it if you farmed it with consistent attention. His savings stood at $97,000. His notebook showed that comparable ground CSR, the mid-80s, in good condition within 20 miles of Albion, had sold between $1,100 and $1,400 per acre in the past 2 years. At 160 acres, the Vessel parcel would likely go somewhere between $176,000 and $224,000. He had $97,000. He drove to the bank in Albion on a Tuesday morning in February and sat across the desk from Ron Halsey, who had been the loan officer at that branch for 15 years and who knew Everett Stanhope's financial history the way he knew the financial histories of all the serious farmers in the county, completely without illusion, with the particular kind of respect that a banker develops for a borrower who has never needed to borrow. Everett told him what he was considering and what he needed. Ron looked at the balance sheet for perhaps 90 seconds. His voice came direct and without preamble. Commitments available. Best rate I can do right now is 7 1/4. Everett thanked him. He went home. He sat with the numbers that evening at the kitchen table, not the ledger this time, just a sheet of paper with the figures arranged, the way August had arranged figures in columns, the relationships between them made visible by their positions on the page. He called Ron back the following morning. Ron picked up, expecting to confirm the paperwork. Everett said he had decided not to use the loan. A pause on the line, longer than Ron's usual pauses. Then his voice careful and genuinely puzzled. "Everett, you have a commitment letter in hand at 7 1/4. The ground is worth twice your savings on a slow day. You'll lose it to a land company before the bidding reaches your number." Everett said he planned to bid what his cash would support, and not a dollar more than that. A silence. Ron said, "That's not how auctions work." Everett said he understood that. He said he appreciated the commitment and wanted to keep it available in case he reconsidered before the sale date. Ron said the commitment would be there. Everett said thank you and hung up and went back to the figures on the sheet of paper and looked at them for a long time. He thought about what August would have done. He thought about the 1980s farms going to auction the borrowed money against inflated collateral, the numbers that had seemed reasonable at the time because the optimism of the time had made them feel like evidence. He thought about the difference between a number that was true and a number that was convenient. He thought about what it meant to know the exact value of what you were reaching for, and to reach only as far as your hand actually extended. He did not call Ron back before the sale date. The auction was on the 3rd Thursday of March, a cold, clear morning, with the sky the particular pale blue that Nebraska produces in early spring when the light has returned, but the warmth is still a month away. The frozen ground was solid underfoot, and the air smelled of turned soil from a field somewhere to the north, where someone had gotten an early start on tillage. 11 bidders had registered. Everett recognized 8 of them. 2 were investors from Omaha he had seen at previous auctions, men in good coats who bid with the calm detachment of people spending other people's money. 1 was a land company representative from Kearney with a phone he consulted between raises. 1 was a neighbor of Clifford Wessel's who had been trying to buy the ground privately for 2 years without meeting Clifford's price, and who had registered today with the determined expression of someone who has decided that the time for private negotiation is over. The bidding opened at $900 per acre. By $1,100, 4 bidders had dropped out, the 2 Omaha investors who had apparently set a ceiling before the sale and honored it, and 2 local farmers who had done their arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusion Everett had arrived at, which was that the ground was good but not exceptional, and the price was going to exceed what the yield would justify over a reasonable horizon. By $1,200, 2 more had dropped out. At $1,250 per acre, the field was down to 3, Everett, the land company representative from Kearney, and the vessel neighbor who was bidding with the particular intensity of someone for whom this had become personal. At $1,300, the neighbor looked at the land company representative and then at the auctioneer and dropped his paddle. The land company representative looked at his phone. He looked at Everett. He raised. Everett raised. The representative raised again, his expression unchanged, the phone back in his coat pocket. Everett looked at the auctioneer. His voice came level and clear in the cold morning air. 1,400. The land company representative looked at his phone for a long moment. He looked at the auctioneer. He shook his head once, a small definitive motion, and lowered his paddle. 160 acres, $1,400 per acre, $224,000 total. In the end, Everett used $97,000 of his own savings and $127,000 of Ron Halsey's money, because the arithmetic of the situation was what it was, and he was his father's son enough to recognize when a number that he had decided in advance was the wrong answer turned out, in the specific circumstances of a specific morning, to be the right one. He paid the loan off in 3 years. The difference column in the ledger during those 3 years recorded the additional interest expense in its own line, clearly labeled reconciled against the yield from the new ground, and the yield from the new ground was what honest ground at 87 CSR produced when it was farmed with consistent attention, which was what Everett had expected it to be. The crowd at the auction was perhaps 40 people on a cold March morning, not large, but the people who were there had been farming Boone County for a long time, and they knew Everett Stanhope's name, and they knew about the elevator complaint and the certification suspension and the restitution checks, and some of them had deposited those checks and understood in the concrete way that deposited money makes things concrete, that the checks would not have existed without a $40 box of paper and a man willing to read what was inside it. When the auctioneer said sold and Everett set his paddle down, the crowd went quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of an auction concluding. It was the quiet of people rearranging something, some collective assessment that had been settled and was now being reconsidered, some understanding of who Everett Stanhope was and what he was capable of that had been incomplete and was now being revised. Not applause, not congratulation. The specific weighted silence of a community recalibrating. Roy was near the back of the crowd. He had driven the hour from Columbus that morning without telling Everett he was coming. He had registered as an observer. He had stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the bidding move from $900 to $1,400, and when the hammer came down, he took off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck with the slow, deliberate motion of a man absorbing something he had not entirely anticipated. He did not find Everett in the crowd that day. He got in his truck and drove back toward Columbus. 2 weeks later, he called. His voice was different from every call before it, quieter, with the particular quality of a man who has decided to say something directly that he has been circling for several years. I should have come out sooner, after the paper, after the restitution. I kept thinking I would, and I kept not doing it. And I want you to know, I understand, that was wrong. Everett said he appreciated it. Roy said he meant it. A silence. Not the difficult silence of the earlier calls. Something closer to the silence of two people who have been on opposite sides of a distance for a long time and are standing at last at the same edge of it. Everett said the ground will need a second pair of eyes this spring if you want to come out. Roy said he would think about it. He came out in April. He and Everett walked the vessel ground together on a Saturday morning, the soil soft from the spring thaw, the fields ready for planting. They did not talk about the elevator or the complaint or the auction. They talked about the drainage on the north end of the field and the soil color in the southeast corner, and whether the tillage from the previous owner had left any compaction issues worth addressing. They talked the way two men talk when they are doing the same work, and the work is what matters. Roy came back in June to help with an equipment repair that required an extra set of hands. He did not come back after that, not regularly, but the calls continued, and the calls were different, and the difference was noted in the column where Everett noted differences and filed accurately and allowed to mean what it meant. Everett farmed 480 acres through the rest of the 90s and into the decade that followed. The home place, the vessel ground, and a third parcel, 80 acres in neighboring Platte County, that came to estate sale in October of 1998, ground that had belonged to a man named Warren Gilchrist, who had farmed it for 40 years and had died without children, the land passing to a nephew in Omaha who had grown up in the city and wanted the matter settled cleanly. The soil rating was 79, a step below the vessel ground, and the asking price reflected it. Everett paid $890 per acre from savings cash on a Tuesday afternoon and drove home in time to update the ledger before the evening was gone. He kept the ledger every Friday evening, the lamp, the coffee going cold at the elbow, the mechanical pencil he had replaced with a ballpoint sometime in the middle years of the decade, a plain blue Bic from the box he kept in the desk drawer, bought in a package of 12 from the office supply in Albion. The ledger did not record this change because the ledger recorded what mattered, and the color of the ink was not what mattered. The columns stayed the same. The method stayed the same. The manila envelopes stayed the same, clipped to the inside front cover and the inside back cover of each year's binder, the scale tickets in front and the elevator receipts in back. The two sets of figures reconciled against each other and against the field estimates every spring when the previous year's books were closed. The difference column continued. It ran below 1% in every year after the elevator's recalibration and the installation of the corrected software. Everett verified this himself every 3 years, the way August had verified his moisture meter against the reference sample in the sealed glass jar, not because he expected to find a problem, but because verification was the practice, and the practice was the thing, and a practice you only maintained when you expected it to be necessary was not really a practice at all. He kept a 50-pound certified test weight on the shelf in August's workshop between the moisture meter reference jar and the small brown notebook in which he recorded each verification. He had bought the weight from a laboratory supply company in Lincoln in 1989, paid for it with a check, kept the receipt in the manila envelope for that year. Every 3 years, he carried it to the elevator's inbound scale, set it on the platform surface, and wrote down what the display read. 1991, 50 pounds even. 1994, 50 pounds even. 1997, 49 pounds 15 ounces. Within the scale stated tolerance, but noted and reported in a brief written letter to the elevator manager, a third manager, by then a younger man named Phil Garrett, who had taken the position after Denny Haas left for a co-op job in Grand Island. Phil Garrett had the scale serviced within the month. He sent Everett a brief note confirming the service and the recalibration. Everett filed the note in the manila envelope for 1997 and wrote the corrected reading 50 pounds, even in the small brown notebook on the shelf in the workshop. 2,050 pounds even. The difference column ran below 1%. This was not a story he told at the diner or at the co-op or at the farm supply. It was not a story he told anywhere, because it was not a story in the sense that required telling. It was simply the condition of things, the baseline against which everything else was measured, the number the column was supposed to carry, and did carry, year after year, because someone had established the practice and maintained it. He was aware in the way that a quiet man is aware of things he does not speak about, that the practice had a cost beyond the time it required. There was the cost of being the person who had filed the complaint, the person who had, in the county's collective memory, done something that most farmers in that situation would not have done, and had been right to do it, and had made the county face a thing it had preferred not to face. Some people were grateful for this in the concrete way that a deposited check made things concrete. Some people were uncomfortable with it in the way that being wrong about something, even accidentally, even in company with everyone else, produces discomfort that attaches itself to the person who demonstrated the wrongness rather than to the wrongness itself. Everett understood both responses. He did not require either one. He updated the ledger on Friday evenings. He calibrated what needed calibrating. He noted the difference in the column labeled difference. That was enough. In the summer of 2001, his niece came to stay. Dessa was the daughter of his younger sister in Omaha, 16 years old, and she arrived at the farm in the second week of June with a duffel bag and a polite, guarded wariness that Everett recognized as the specific wariness of a city-raised teenager deposited somewhere they hadn't chosen by parents who believed the experience would be good for them. She was not rude about it. She had been raised well enough to keep the wariness mostly internal. But it was there in the way she looked at the fields on that first morning, the immensity of flat ground under a sky that offered no interruption, with an expression that was not quite discomfort and not quite wonder, but something between them, that had not yet decided which way to go. Everett put her to work, not with explanation, not with a speech about the value of farm labor or the importance of understanding where food came from or any of the other framings that adults sometimes apply to work when they want a young person to receive it as a gift rather than a demand. He put her to work the way August had put him to work, by including her in what needed doing day after day, letting the work explain itself through repetition and consequence, and the specific satisfaction of a task completed correctly. She drove the grain cart by the end of her second week. It took her 3 attempts to get the feel of the turning radius in the tight space behind the grain bin, and on the 3rd attempt she clipped the corner post of the bin door with the cart's front wheel and left a mark in the painted steel that was still visible years later, and she had come to Everett afterward with the expression of someone waiting to be told how serious the damage was. He had looked at the mark and said it wasn't structural and gone back to what he was doing. She had stood there for a moment and then followed him and gone back to what she was doing too. By her 3rd week, she could read a scale ticket with enough accuracy to catch a dockage calculation that didn't match the moisture reading on the settlement sheet, a small error, a rounding issue in the 3rd decimal that wouldn't have amounted to anything significant over a single load, but that was an error nonetheless, and an error was an error regardless of its magnitude, and you noted it and reported it and had it corrected. She had brought the ticket to Everett with a question rather than a statement, because she was not yet certain enough of her reading to state it. He had looked at the ticket and confirmed her calculation and called the elevator and had the sheet corrected. She had not said anything after that, but something in the way she held the next ticket was different, a fraction more deliberate, a fraction more confident, the posture of someone who has discovered that what they suspected was actually true and has updated their assessment of themselves accordingly. In July, she began sitting at the kitchen table on Friday evenings while Everett worked through the ledger. Not keeping it herself, she was not ready for that yet, and Everett did not rush it, because August had not rushed it with him. She sat across from him and watched the process, the way he had watched August, the columns, the manila envelopes, the reconciliation, the figure that went into the difference column at the end of the year's accounting. One Friday evening in the middle of August, with the harvest still 6 weeks away, and the corn standing tall and dark in the fields outside the kitchen window, she asked about the envelopes. Everett explained August's system, the 2 envelopes, the scale tickets in front, the elevator receipts in back, the reconciliation, the column. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the open ledger with the focused attention she had been developing all summer, not the attention of someone performing interest, but the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand how a thing worked. Then she asked, "What if the difference is wrong? Like, what if it's bigger than it should be?" Everett looked at the column. He looked at it for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at things that reminded him of other things. The manila envelope, the small check mark in the upper right corner, the voice on the phone at 2 in the morning telling him what he already suspected. His voice came quiet and level, the voice August had used when he meant something completely. Then you find out why. She left at the end of August and went back to Omaha for her junior year of high school. She did not talk much about the summer to her friends, because there was not much to say that would translate into the language of that world: the grain cart, the ledger, the scale tickets, the Friday evenings at the kitchen table. These things did not have a grammar that moved easily between one world and another, but she had learned them anyway, and they stayed. She came back the following summer, and the summer after that. By the time she finished her degree in agricultural economics at the University of Nebraska in 2008, she had been keeping the ledger alongside Everett for 7 summers, and the system had become hers in every way that mattered. She knew the Manila envelope method. She knew the reconciliation. She knew the difference column and what it meant and what to do when the number in it was larger than it should be. She knew in the specific and unromantic way that you know things you have been taught by someone who did not accept approximation, that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion, and that opinions had no place in a farm record. She took over the operation in 2011 when Everett was 56 and ready to step back from the daily work, but not from the Friday evening ledger, which he continued to review every week, sitting across from Dessa, now watching her work through the columns, the way August had watched him checking for errors he rarely found, and finding, when he did find them, that she had usually already caught them herself, and had a note explaining the correction in the margin. He stopped checking the way August had stopped checking, because there was nothing to correct. The workshop was still standing, the poured concrete, the wood stove in the corner, the oak workbench along the south wall that August had built from planks in 1952, and that had not moved since. The lathe from Kearney still running its motor, replaced once in 1994 with a replacement motor ordered from a machine shop in Columbus and installed by Everett on a Saturday afternoon. The drill press on its bolted stand, the pegboards with their tools in their places, the gaps filled only by the tools that were in use and replaced when the work was done. Dessa's daughter, 13 years old now, and possessed of the specific focused curiosity about the drill press that suggested she had been watching it and thinking about it for longer than she had been allowed to admit, had been told she could use it when she turned 14, which was the same age Dessa had been when she first used it, which was the same age Everett had been when August had decided he was ready. The certified test weight sat on the shelf above the workbench between the moisture meter reference jar and the brown notebook, which had been joined by a second notebook, Dessa's begun when she took over the verification checks in 2011, and more recently by a third, smaller notebook in a hand that was still developing its consistency, the letters slightly uneven, the numbers carefully formed belonging to Dessa's daughter, who had begun accompanying her mother on the 3-year checks and writing down the readings herself. The last reading was 50 pounds even. It had always been 50 pounds even, or close enough that the difference was findable and once found correctable. That was the whole of it. That was in the end exactly what it was supposed to be. In the fall of 2009, the Nebraska Farmers Union sent Everett a second invitation to speak at their annual meeting in Kearney. The first had come in August of 1988 on official letterhead from the Lincoln office 3 months after the newspaper story about the elevator certification. He had read it twice, put it in a file folder in the desk drawer, and gone back to the harvest. He had not responded. The second invitation came 21 years later, from a different director in a different year's letterhead, but with the same essential request: would he be willing to speak at the annual meeting about the Boone County elevator complaint and what farmers could learn from it. He sat with the letter for 3 days before he answered it. He thought about why he had declined the first time, and the reason had been that in 1988 he had not yet been far enough from the thing to speak about it without the thing being present in the room in a way that would make it about the elevator and the settlement, rather than about what the elevator and the settlement had demonstrated. He had not had the distance then. He had not had the perspective that only comes from years of continued practice, from 17 more difference columns, each one running honest and close, each one confirmed by a test weight on a scale platform, each one adding to the record of a method that worked. He had the distance now. He wrote back and said he would come. He drove to Kearney on a Thursday morning in the second week of November, the harvested fields dark, and turned on both sides of the highway for the full distance, the sky the low flat gray of a Nebraska November that carried neither threat nor promise. He arrived 40 minutes early and sat in a chair near the back of the conference hall and watched the room fill with the people who came to these things: farmers, extension staff, co-op board members, a few faces from the state agriculture department, people who had driven an hour or 2 hours on a gray Thursday morning because they believed the work they did mattered and that talking to other people who did it was worth the drive. 200 people approximately. He recognized a handful. He had not written anything down. He had thought about what he wanted to say for several weeks and had decided that notes would make it feel like a presentation, and it was not a presentation. It was a description of a practice. Practices did not require notes. You described what you did and why you did it, and what happened when you did it correctly, and what happened when you didn't. And if the description was accurate, it would be useful, and if it was not accurate, it would not be useful, regardless of how well it was organized. The director introduced him briefly, a Boone County farmer who had filed a formal complaint in 1988 that had resulted in a scale recalibration and a restitution settlement affecting producers across the county, a man who had declined to speak about it publicly for more than 2 decades. A few people in the room nodded. A few leaned forward slightly with the particular attention of people who have heard a version of a story and are now about to hear it from the source. Everett walked to the front of the room and stood at the podium for a moment without speaking. Not for effect, because he was organizing the first sentence, which was the only sentence that needed organizing in advance. The first sentence being the one that established whether what followed was going to be worth the room's time. Then he spoke. He said the yield monitor on a modern combine was a remarkable instrument, and that he trusted his within its stated tolerance, which the manufacturer listed as plus or minus 3%, and that he verified it against the scale ticket every year, and that the scale ticket was only as good as the scale, and that the scale was only as good as the last time someone had placed a certified test weight on the platform and written down what it read. He said this without drama because it was not dramatic. It was a maintenance procedure. It was a number. Numbers had sources, and sources could be verified, and verification was the practice. He said the gap between what a farm reported and what it actually produced was not a rounding error. It was a number. Numbers had sources. Sources could be found if you were willing to keep the records and do the work. He said his father had taught him that when he was 12 years old at a kitchen table in Boone County, and he had been trying to deserve that teaching ever since. He paused. He said he wanted to talk about Lester Covell. He said that Lester Covell had farmed 480 acres of Boone County ground for 32 years, and that in 1975 he had noticed a gap in his records that he spent the last 11 years of his life trying to explain, and that he had been right about the gap, and right about its direction, and right in the end about its source, right about all of it, and that he had died at 74 years old without seeing a single figure in his notebook confirmed. He said he hoped the people in the room would remember Lester Covell's name. He said that what had happened to Lester Covell was what happened when a community decided, without examining the evidence, that a farmer's careful and methodical observations were the symptoms of an old man's confusion rather than the products of a lifetime's rigor. He said the cost of that decision had not been borne by the community that made it. It had been borne by Lester Covell, who had been right and who had died, not knowing that he was right, and who had deserved better from the county that had known him for 30 years. He let that sit for a moment. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that requires a moment before the next thing. Then he said one more thing. He said the $40 he had paid for Lester Covell's records was the best investment he had ever made. Not in the financial sense, though the financial sense was also true. In the sense that Lester's records had confirmed for him something he had suspected, but had not yet proven that the gap between what you are told and what is actually true is almost always findable, and that finding it is simply a matter of deciding that the finding matters. He said that was not a complicated idea. He said his father had expressed it in 4 words when Everett was 12 years old and had asked what you did when the numbers didn't match. He said you find out why. He stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the waiting quiet of an audience expecting more, but the fuller quiet of people holding something they had just been given, turning it in their hands, feeling its weight and what it was made of. Then the applause came, warm, unhurried, the particular applause of a room full of farmers on a grey Thursday morning in November, not dramatic, not brief, carrying the specific weight of people who understood what had been described because they did the same work and lived with the same numbers and knew in the concrete way that all farming knowledge is concrete what it meant to find a gap and close it. Edmund Cray was in the 3rd row. Everett did not see him until the applause was settling and people were beginning to move standing, turning to neighbors, the ordinary reorganization of a room when a session ends. Edmund was sitting very still in the way he had always sat very still, with the unhurried patience of a man who had spent his career being the least agitated person in every situation he encountered. He was 83 years old. His hair had gone fully white, and his movements, when he finally stood, were the careful movements of a man for whom the body had become something to negotiate rather than simply inhabit. But he held the clipboard under his arm, the same way he had always held it, the worn corners, the slight forward tilt out of a habit that 22 years of retirement had not touched. He had driven up from Fullerton that morning because the director had called him the previous week and told him who was speaking. He had not told Everett he was coming. Everett made his way toward the 3rd row through the people moving in the other direction, and Edmund stood and waited, and they shook hands the way they had shaken hands on the first morning in the driveway in October of 1987, and on the last afternoon after the 3rd elevator load, without ceremony, with the solid, undemonstrative firmness of 2 men who had once done a careful and necessary thing together, and had not required much discussion about it at the time, and did not require much discussion about it now. Edmund's voice came quiet, almost private, in the noise of the room moving around them, his eyes steady and direct. Your father would have recognized what you did. Everett held the handshake. He thought about August at the kitchen table in October of 1967, the mechanical pencil, the 2 manila envelopes, the question a 12-year-old boy had asked, and the 4 words that had answered it. He thought about Lester Covell writing in a narrow-ruled notebook at 71 that he was not certain he had enough time left to find someone who could reach the part of the problem he couldn't reach from where he stood. He thought about a 50-pound test weight reading 49 pounds and 2 ounces on an October morning in 1987, and the silence on the drive back, and the legal pad on the kitchen table, and the 42 pages he had typed on a machine with a sticking E key through the winter of 1987 and 1988. He thought about Patricia Marsh sitting across that same table with her hands on her father's last manila envelope, saying, "We told him he was tired. We told him he was looking for a reason that wasn't in himself." His voice came back to Edmund quiet and certain. He did it first. Edmund nodded once, the deliberate confirming nod of a man acknowledging something that had always been true and had now been said out loud in the right company. He picked up his clipboard. He moved toward the exit with the careful, unhurried deliberateness he had always moved with, and the room made space for him without knowing it was making space. And then he was through the door, and the November light received him, and the conference room continued its ordinary post-session life around Everett, and the gray light came flat and even through the high windows. Everett stood for a moment longer in the third row. Then he put on his jacket and walked out into the November morning and got in his truck and drove home. The highway ran straight and flat through the harvested fields for the full distance between Kearney and Albion, the dark-turned soil on both sides carrying the particular stillness of ground that has finished its year's work and is resting now under a sky that offered nothing dramatic, no sunset, no colors, just the long, honest gray of a November afternoon in the middle of the country, the light going slowly, without announcement, the way it always went at this time of year. He pulled into the driveway as the last of the light was leaving. The farmhouse was lit from inside. Deza had driven out from Albion that afternoon to run some figures from the fall's deliveries through the preliminary reconciliation, and she had left the kitchen light on the way. She always left it when she knew he was coming home after dark, a habit she had developed without being asked, a small practical act of consideration that he had never mentioned, and she had never explained, the kind of thing that accumulates between people who work closely together and comes to mean something that neither of them would necessarily be able to articulate if pressed. If the light came through the kitchen window and lay in a long yellow rectangle across the frozen ground of the yard, reaching almost to the tires of the truck. He sat for a moment before going in. He sat in the particular quiet of a man who has said what he needed to say and has nothing further to prove, and is allowing the day to settle around him before he goes inside and becomes again the person who attends to the ordinary things, the ledger, the coffee, the lamp above the table. He thought about Edmund Cray driving south on Highway 14 toward Fullerton with the clipboard on the seat beside him and the canvas equipment bag in the bed of the truck, and 22 years of retirement behind him, and the particular satisfaction Everett imagined it as a quiet satisfaction, because Edmund was a man for whom all satisfactions were quiet, of having seen a thing through to its right conclusion. He thought about the conference room in Kearney and the 200 people on a gray Thursday morning and the warm, unhurried applause. He thought about Lester Covell, who had been right. He went inside. Dessa had left the ledger open on the kitchen table to the current crop year, the columns filled in her handwriting through the previous Friday's entry, the figures clean and consistent in her hand, which was more upright than Everett's and less formal than August's, and entirely her own. The manila envelope for the year's scale tickets was clipped to the front cover. The elevator receipts were clipped to the back. In the upper right corner of the front envelope in pencil was the small check mark she made when the preliminary reconciliation was complete, unhurried clean, a simple mark confirming that the figures had been examined and the examination was done. The same mark August had made. The same mark Everett had made for 28 years. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot Dessa had left warm on the stove, dark roast, the kind August had kept, the kind Everett had kept all his adult life without actively choosing it, because it was simply what coffee was, and carried it to the table and sat down. He looked at the open ledger. He looked at the difference column. The figure for this year was less than 1%, as it had been every year since the spring of 1988, as it would be next year if someone remembered to carry the test weight to the elevator scale and set it on the platform and write down what the display read. Dessa would remember. Her daughter, when she was old enough, would remember too. He picked up the pen from the table, a plain blue Bic, one of the 12 from the box in the desk drawer. He noted the date in the upper right corner of the Friday entry. He closed the ledger. Outside, the night had come fully down over Boone County. The fields were dark in all directions, the home place the Vessel ground 2 miles to the northeast, the Gilchrist parcel in Platte County, all of it dark and flat and immense and patient, holding its count the way it always had in the cold November ground, indifferent to argument, keeping its own record. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was on. The manila envelopes held what they had always held, the tickets, the receipts, the small paper, proof of a season's transactions, clipped inside the covers of a ledger that had been kept without interruption since August Stanhope sat down at this table in 1958 with a mechanical pencil and decided that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion and that opinions had no place in a farm record. Passed from his hands to his sons, from his sons to a niece's. The handwriting changing across the decades, August's block printing, precise and economical, Everett's slightly rounder hand, unhurried learning, and then exceeding its teacher. Dessa's upright, confident script, already the hand of someone who has been doing this long enough that the doing has settled into the body. The columns staying the same. The difference column running honest and close and verifiable year after year in the particular quiet of a Friday evening at the end of a long week on a farm that owed nothing to anyone and kept its own account with the same patient attention it had always kept it. The coffee cooled at his elbow. The house settled in the cold with the small sounds that old houses make, the creak of a joist, the tick of the radiator, the faint pressure of wind against the north-facing windows. And somewhere to the south, in a house in Fullerton, on a street Everett had never driven, an 83-year-old man set his clipboard on the kitchen counter and put the kettle on and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the dark November fields beyond the edge of town, thinking about nothing in particular, or perhaps about the specific and uncomplicated satisfaction of a scale that read correctly, of a number, that was what it said. It was of a measurement taken honestly in a world that did not always take its measurements honestly and suffered in the ways that worlds suffer for the omission. 50 pounds even, the way it was always supposed to read. And in a farmhouse in Albion, in the room off the kitchen where August had kept his records and where Everett kept them, still, a 13-year-old girl had been sitting at the small desk for the past hour, with a manila envelope in her hands and a scale ticket in her lap, and the particular focused expression of someone working out an arithmetic problem they have not been asked to work out but cannot quite leave alone. She had found something that didn't match. She was not certain enough yet to say what it was. The numbers were close enough that it might be her own error, a decimal in the wrong place, a figure she had misread from the ticket. She would check it again. She would check it twice, and then a third time if the first two didn't agree, because that was how you checked numbers when you were not certain. And she had learned this summer at her mother's elbow that certainty was not something you assumed, it was something you earned, calculation by calculation, check by check, manila envelope by manila envelope. She sharpened her pencil. She checked it again. The difference was real, small, less than 1%, well within the elevator's stated tolerance. But real, and real meant it had a source, and the source meant it could be found. She wrote the figure in the upper right corner of the ticket in her uneven, carefully formed hand. She labeled it in the only word she had been taught to use for a gap between what the record said and what the arithmetic produced. Difference. She went to find her mother. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment with it before you answer. Think about the person who taught you to pay attention, not to pay attention in a general way, to pay attention to something specific. The gap between what you were told and what you could actually verify. The number that didn't quite add up. The thing everyone else had decided was settled that you couldn't stop turning over in your mind. Who taught you to treat that as a question worth answering rather than a rounding error worth ignoring? If you know that person's name, if you can picture the table they sat at and the way they held their pencil and the words they used when they explained it to you, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story meant something to you, if you believe that careful attention is worth something, that the records nobody wants sometimes turn out to be the records that matter most, subscribe and stay with me. There are more of these, and they are all about the same thing.